It was an unusually quiet morning on Manhattan's Upper East Side. The streets, normally flooded with traffic and noise, were subdued under a light drizzle. People hurried under umbrellas, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. New York never truly rests, not even on Sundays. But inside a century-old stone church, nestled between high-rises and boutiques, the noise of the world had paused for just a moment. The congregation at St. Andrew's had gathered for its traditional morning service. The organ filled the arched ceiling with the soft swell of sacred music, and the priest was just beginning his homily on forgiveness and the meaning of grace. Candles flickered at the altar. The wooden pews creaked as elderly couples shifted in their seats, and children fidgeted beside their mothers. It was ordinary, calm, familiar, until the heavy door at the back of the church creaked open. Heads turned instinctively, just curious at first. But when the man stepped through, even the priest fell silent. There was no mistaking the broad frame, the iconic red tie, the unmistakable posture. It wasn't a look-alike. It wasn't a stunt. President Donald J. Trump had just walked into the church. There were no flashing lights, no camera crew, no entourage of agents with earpieces. Just Trump, alone. He nodded respectfully toward the altar, then slowly made his way down the aisle, every step echoing louder than the last. People whispered. Some stiffened in surprise. Others stared, unsure if they should stand or remain seated. Trump walked with a sense of quiet gravity. This wasn't a campaign stop. It wasn't for attention. He reached the third row, paused, and sat beside an elderly woman who clutched a rosary, seemingly unaware of who he was. The priest, still frozen behind the pulpit, cleared his throat and tried to continue, but he didn't get far. A sharp, trembling voice cut through the stillness. From the far left side of the sanctuary, an older man rose. His spine was slightly hunched, his movements stiff. He wore a black leather jacket, a military-style cap with faded embroidery, and a face lined with decades of hard truth. A Vietnam veteran by the look of him. He didn't ask for attention. He demanded it. I served 2 tours in the jungle. I watched friends die with flags on their shoulders, he began, voice rising. And now I'm supposed to sit here and worship beside him? A cold silence fell over the church. No one moved. The priest's mouth hung open, unsure what to say. A woman covered her child's ears. The veteran pointed straight at Trump. You divided this country. You turned neighbor against neighbor. And you think showing up here, unannounced, will make it right? Trump didn't flinch. He looked up slowly, his expression unreadable, calm, steady. He stood, quietly. And for the first time in the service, no one knew what would happen next. All eyes were fixed on the 2 men now standing in the center of the sanctuary. The veteran, still pointing with a trembling hand, was breathing hard, his face red, his voice cracking not from weakness, but from something deeper. Years of disappointment, grief, disillusionment. President Trump stood still, his gaze locked onto the man in front of him. The room remained frozen, like time itself had paused inside those stone walls. Even the candles seemed to flicker more slowly, but Trump didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike back. Instead, he took a breath, stepped forward once, and spoke in a tone that was unusually calm, almost too calm for a man so often accused of being loud, brash, and unfiltered. I didn't come here to be seen, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the pews. I came here to be quiet, to reflect, and to pray. The veteran scoffed, almost laughing. You came to pray? After everything? After January 6th? After families were torn apart, friendships ended, people lost jobs because of politics you helped ignite? The congregation flinched. It was the question everyone was thinking, but no one had dared to say. Trump didn't move. He just kept looking at the man, almost studying him. Then he replied, not with a speech, not with fire, but with something rare. I came here, Trump said, because even a man like me has to face God. A murmur spread through the crowd. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't polished. It was real, and no one had expected that. The veteran lowered his hand slowly, but his eyes still burned. "I don't hate you," he said, voice breaking. "But I buried men who fought for the truth. I'm not sure they'd recognize this country anymore." Trump nodded. "I know," he said softly. "Sometimes I don't either." And in that moment, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the tension that had gripped it. The anger was still there, but it had been pierced by something else. Sincerity, regret, maybe even grace. A woman in the second row began to cry quietly. An older man removed his hat and held it to his chest. No one knew what to say, not even the veteran, and yet, everyone was waiting for what would happen next. The silence hung heavy in the air, thicker than before. Even the priest had stepped back from the pulpit, unsure whether to intervene or simply bear witness to what was unfolding. It was no longer a Sunday service. It was something deeper, something raw. The veteran stood frozen in place, as if caught between duty and emotion. His hand was lowered now, resting on the cane that had steadied him through years of quiet struggle. But his eyes were still locked on the man standing before him. President Trump hadn't moved. He didn't shift, didn't look around the room for support. He simply waited, as if he knew the veteran wasn't finished. And he wasn't. "I just have one question," the veteran finally said, his voice quieter now, but more cutting because of it. "When you leave this church today, will you go back to being the same man who divided us, or the man who just stood here and said he sees it too?" Trump blinked once. He didn't rush to answer. He let the weight of the question sit there, in front of everyone like a stone placed gently on the altar. "I've never claimed to be perfect," Trump began slowly. "I've made decisions that pleased half the country and infuriated the other half, and maybe sometimes I've let the fight become louder than the reason for it." The veteran's eyes didn't leave him, neither did anyone else's. "But I love this country," Trump continued, more firmly now. "I've bled for it in ways people don't see. Not in a uniform like yours, but through battles that left scars just the same. And I came here today, not to prove anything. I came because I needed to remember why it was worth fighting for in the first place." The church was silent. You could hear a cough echo from the back pews. A teenage boy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the organist had frozen, hands hovering above the keys, unsure whether music would make things better or ruin the moment. Then, out of nowhere, the old woman beside Trump placed her frail hand on his sleeve. She leaned in and whispered something, but it was just loud enough for the nearest row to hear. "Maybe today," she said, "we all needed to remember." Trump looked at her, then back at the veteran. He didn't smile. He didn't gesture for applause. He simply nodded once, slow, deliberate. And somehow, without warning, the congregation began to stand. Not in protest, not in celebration, just quietly, one by one, in silence. No one knew exactly why. But somehow they knew it was right. The silence, though powerful, was fragile like glass stretched thin across something boiling beneath. As more people slowly stood in quiet solidarity, there was a rare and almost sacred unity taking shape in the room. For one moment, there were no sides. No slogans, just people. But not everyone was willing to let it stay that way. From the far back row, a man in his 30s, clean-shaven with thick-rimmed glasses and a stiff blue scarf wrapped tightly around his neck, stepped forward. He had been silent the entire time, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Now he cleared his throat loudly, piercing the stillness like a needle through silk. "Oh, please," he said. His voice echoed, sharp and dismissive. "Are we really pretending this is some kind of redemption arc?" Heads turned. The elderly woman beside Trump stiffened. The veteran slowly sank back onto his pew, face tightening. The man walked further down the aisle now, each step sharper than the last. He shows up unannounced, plays humble for 5 minutes, and now we're all supposed to just What? Forget everything? A murmur rose. The tension returned like a wave. Some people looked away. Others looked at Trump, but Trump didn't react. He watched the man calmly, his hands loosely folded in front of him. You still have supporters storming buildings, the man continued, voice rising. You still stand behind every divisive word you've ever spoken. And now you want applause because you sat through a sermon and didn't tweet about it? A few gasps. Someone said enough under their breath. The man now stood just a few feet from the pulpit, looking directly at Trump. You think you can walk into this space, into this church, and use it to wash your hands of everything you've done? And then he looked around the room. Shame on you all. That's when the priest stepped forward again, finally finding his voice. This is a house of God, he said firmly. If you came to condemn, you came for the wrong reasons. But the man didn't back down. He pointed directly at Trump, his voice shaking now not with nerves, but with fury. Some people lose sons and daughters because of division, and he thrives on it. The room froze again, and everyone turned toward Trump, waiting, wondering how he would respond. Trump stood in complete stillness as the younger man's words faded into the thick, unsettled air. No one spoke. The priest had stepped back once more. The veteran lowered his head. Even the children in the back rows, usually fidgeting by now, sat frozen. The man's final accusation still echoed. You thrive on division. Trump inhaled slowly through his nose and took a step forward, not toward the pulpit, not toward the priest, but toward the man who had just condemned him in front of the entire congregation. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but every word hit like the striking of a bell. You don't know what I've lost, Trump began. The man blinked, taken aback. Trump didn't pause. You don't know what it feels like to be hated not for what you've done, but for who you are. For what your name means to people who've never even shaken your hand. He took another step forward, his voice rising just slightly, not with anger, but with fire. You talk about division? So do I every day. I see it in families, in schools, in churches. And yes, I've played a part in it. I own that. But you're here right now dividing. You came not to heal, not to pray, not even to listen. You came to provoke. To stand above everyone and point your finger like you're better. The man opened his mouth, but Trump raised a hand. No, let me finish. The room was silent. I didn't come here for forgiveness, Trump said. Not from you. Not even from this church. I came because I wanted to remember what it means to be accountable to something greater than politics. He looked around the sanctuary. To something greater than power, greater than polls, greater than anger. And then, turning back to the man, Trump's voice dropped again. You call me divisive? Maybe I am. But I never walked into a church full of strangers and tried to tear them apart. The man's jaw clenched. But he said nothing. And then Trump looked to the priest, nodded once, and sat back down without another word. The man stood frozen for a moment longer, his face flushed, hands trembling. But then he turned and slowly walked out of the church. No one followed. And once the doors closed behind him, a single voice from the back whispered, just loud enough for the front rows to hear. He came to pray. That's more than some people ever do. The doors had barely clicked shut behind the angry man when the silence returned. But it was different now, heavier. The kind of silence that lingers after something deep has shifted, not just in the room, but in the people within it. President Trump remained seated, his hands folded, eyes forward. He didn't look for validation. He didn't nod in victory. He simply sat, as if the weight of the moment hadn't changed him, but humbled him. Then, from the far right side of the sanctuary, an older woman slowly stood. She looked to be in her late 70s, dressed in a modest floral dress with a faded American flag pin on her collar. Her voice was soft, but firm, clear, unshaken. I lost my grandson in Afghanistan, she said, turning slightly toward the center of the room. He believed in this country, no matter who was president. She turned her eyes to Trump. "And I don't care if you were perfect or not. None of us are. But today, I saw a man walk into a church with no camera crew, no press, no speech. Just himself, and that means something." People began to nod quietly. Then another voice rose from the other side. A man in his 60s, silver hair, hand resting on the back of the pew in front of him. "My father was a pastor," he said. "And he always told me what a man says behind a microphone isn't who he is. Who he is what he does when no one's watching." His eyes locked on Trump. "Today you didn't preach. You listened. You stood. And you didn't walk out." The priest, still standing behind the pulpit, swallowed hard and finally spoke again. "This house," he said carefully, "was built for sinners, not saints. And if we start deciding who is worthy to enter, then none of us belong." A wave of quiet affirmation swept through the pews. A tearful woman reached over and grabbed Trump's hand gently. An elderly veteran near the front removed his cap, stood tall, and saluted without saying a word. And Trump? He simply nodded once more, eyes lowered, the noise of the outside world locked behind those church doors. But inside, something sacred had been restored. As the murmurs faded and the warmth of the room began to settle back into reverent quiet, the priest prepared to continue with the service. But just before he could open his Bible, a small voice rose from the middle pews, unexpected, innocent, and crystal clear. "Is he a bad man?" The room stilled again. Not in fear, but in heartbreak. All eyes turned to the source of the voice, a boy, no older than 7, sitting between his mother and father. He wore a tiny clip-on tie, his shoes barely touching the floor. His hands clutched a crumpled church program, and his big brown eyes were locked on Donald Trump. His mother looked horrified, but the boy's question had already filled the room. It wasn't asked with malice. It wasn't loaded with politics. It was pure, honest, the kind of question only a child could ask without agenda. Trump turned slightly in his seat, facing the boy. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and spoke in a voice so soft it made the entire church lean in. "No, son," he said, "I've made mistakes. But I've always tried to love this country with everything I have." The boy blinked. "Do you love God too?" Trump nodded slowly. "I do. That's why I'm here." The boy turned to his mom and whispered something. She closed her eyes, exhaled deeply, and put her arm around him. From somewhere near the front, a man whispered, "That's the only answer that matters." And for the first time that morning, Trump closed his eyes, not because he was tired, but because, in that moment, nothing else needed to be said. The service eventually resumed, but something had changed. The sermon, once just another Sunday message, now felt personal, raw, real, as if every line spoken from the pulpit was connected to what had just unfolded. People listened differently. They sat a little straighter, prayed a little deeper. President Trump remained seated in silence, his head bowed, hands clasped, not in a political gesture, but in something that looked far more human. And as the final hymn echoed through the vaulted ceiling, the congregation began to rise, not hurriedly, but with a kind of reverence usually reserved for funerals or moments of transformation. Then the heavy doors of the church opened once again, but this time not by a visitor walking in. Now it was the world waiting outside. A few onlookers had gathered word had leaked, somehow. A local news photographer raised his camera as the first members of the congregation stepped into the gray New York daylight. Another man held his phone high, already live-streaming, narrating what little he knew. But what they didn't capture, what no lens could fully hold, was the look on the faces of those walking out. There were no signs, no chants, no shouting, just quiet tears, thoughtful glances, and a kind of unity that couldn't be manufactured. When Trump finally stepped through the doorway, no one shoved a microphone in his face. No one demanded a statement. Instead, an elderly man standing on the sidewalk gave a slow nod and said simply, "Thank you for coming." Trump didn't respond with a speech. He placed one hand gently on the man's shoulder, gave a subtle nod, and continued walking. Behind him, the bells of the church began to ring, not in celebration, not in warning, but as a reminder that even the most divided moments can carry the seeds of something holy. The bells faded into the background as Trump walked slowly down the steps of the church. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't wave. And yet, somehow, his silence said more than any press conference ever could. People stepped aside, not because they were afraid, but because they respected what had just taken place inside those walls. A moment that didn't need spin. A moment that wouldn't trend, but a moment that mattered. Just before reaching the black SUV waiting by the curb, Trump paused. He turned not toward the cameras but back toward the church. He looked up at the old stone building, rain still clinging to its arched windows. Inside, people lingered, hugging one another, some praying, others simply sitting in silence. The boy who had asked the question earlier stood near the front door now, peeking out at him, eyes wide. Trump raised his hand, not high, not for show, but low and steady. A small gesture, a personal one. And then he was gone. The door closed, the car pulled away. And just like that, the street returned to normal. The honking resumed. The rain came down a little harder. But something in the hearts of those who had been inside had changed. They hadn't just witnessed a man. They had witnessed a moment. And for many, that was more than enough. If this story moved you, even just for a moment, then don't scroll away. Subscribe now and join us as we continue to share the stories that matter, the ones the mainstream won't tell, and the ones that stay with you long after they end. Because in times like these, we don't just need truth. We need heart. Thanks for watching.